All right. Good afternoon to everyone. It might be good morning for some of you, actually. My name is Abdiel Brilhante, and we're here for today and also the next couple of Fridays to talk about testing. So testing for React, testing for front-end development. Today, we'll just go over some of the basics, concepts, and some context as well. But yeah, let's get into it. I'll start with the $1 million question, which is, and this might be slightly different for some of you, but my experience at least is that front-end developers don't really have a culture of testing as much as the back-end developers do, at least. Over the years, I've been trying to come up with a set of reasons as the possibilities as to why people don't really test as often as they should, at least. And I myself am an example of someone who spent some of the first years of my career without writing a single test. And again, I've been trying to come up with the reasons as to why. So the first thing that comes to mind is just how much more visual front-end development is compared to, for example, if you're developing an API or something. It's very common for you to just have a browser window, your IDE, and then you make some changes to the code, you look at the browser, and then back at the code, and then back at the browser. This kind of creates this loop where you start to trust your eyes and what you're seeing, maybe a little bit too much. And naturally, testing is there to cover everything else, but you kind of end up trusting what you're seeing too much because it's so much more visual, because of CSS, or also because of some other factors as well. Then you have the browser itself. As an environment, as a runtime, is very different. It's event-driven. You have the DOM, which is something kind of very peculiar to interact with, either directly or through a framework. But especially the fact that you have a real user interacting with your interface and your inputs and buttons and everything in a way that is much more unpredictable and much less structured than something, again, to use an example of a REST API, where it's very, again, predictable. It's a JSON input, it's a JSON output. Obviously, the logic in the midfield there is very complex, but in terms of interactions, it's very different and much more complex, which also means it's much more complex to test as well, to set it up. So to compound with that, you have the fact that at least until a couple of years, maybe 3 years ago, the tooling wasn't great, far from it, actually. And if anything, it has gotten much better at this point. Like in 2022, it's much better, much easier to get started with testing and to keep a testing code base. However, it's still not as good as what you see in the backend, at least in my experience. And similar to that, you have the community itself. So the collective knowledge that we have as a community of front-end developers. So stuff like the available articles, courses, tutorials, even things like Stack Overflow answers, not necessarily the questions, in terms of quantity, but especially in terms of quality. So again, you don't have a lot of people testing, you don't have a lot of people with a lot of experience with testing. The content available for everyone to learn is not as good. And then you have all the other stuff, the things that aren't necessarily tied to front-end development specifically, just the reasons that people think that testing is a waste of time, for example. Which it very much isn't, but it's in there as well. So initially, I did want to also recommend this course. So it's called Testing JavaScript. It's by Kent C. Dotz. If you're in the React world, you know who he is. This is not a course that I personally have gone through, but I do know multiple people who have bought the course, went through it, and speak very highly of it. This is the course that everyone recommends for testing. It will obviously go in much more depth compared to us here for 90 minutes of 3 talks. So if you're interested, a couple of things on this. It's a paid course, yes, but there is a pricing parity policy. So if you go there, for example, if you're in Brazil, you will see there's a 55% discount on the original price in dollars. And if you're actually interested in going through it and paying for it, there is something called Owlish Academy, and you could get the funds for it. And information on Owlish Academy and everything on that side, you can talk to Mr. Luciano. Actually, he would have much more information about that. But it's, again, highly recommended. I think it even goes through some of the Node.js stuff, not necessarily just front-end development, but there is a focus on front-end development here. All right, so I did want to hammer home a few points as well, a few things on the reasons why we do test. Even if, as mentioned before, there are some challenges, there are some peculiarities about front-end development and the DOM and the interactions and everything. So one, probably the most obvious one, is it's much cheaper to fix something that was found earlier in the process. So something that is in production, a bug in production, is much more expensive than something that was caught in QA, for example. But then in turn, if you caught that earlier during local development when testing, that's also cheaper. That's not going to block a production deployment, for example. So there's lots of reasons there. And even in situations, for example, not just the stuff that you're developing right now, the new features or bug fixes, but also we've always all been there as well. Like if you fix something in production, but then that breaks something else unexpected, and finding out that bug is also a process that sometimes takes the production deployment for you to find out. And having that code originally covered by tests would give you much more trust in the code that you push into production. There's much less of that anxiety when there's a production deployment. And then besides being very effective in testing, automated testing, in finding out those issues, it's also very efficient. So as a front-end developer, if you are a front-end developer, you know that even a single or a simple page has a lot of complexity hidden in there. There's API requests, there's lots of ifs and else's and ternary operations and loading states and everything. So that results in a lot of different paths that a user can take and that your code can take. And so if you have a QA team, for example, or a QA engineer doing that testing manually, that demands a lot of time. And if you just have testing, automated tests developer for that, you can have those checks being done in seconds or minutes, either locally or in a pipeline. And again, you can test that over and over again and be sure that a lot of the paths are being covered. It doesn't mean necessarily that every single path is going to be covered, and we will talk about code coverage in the next week. But again, the point still stands. It's much more efficient than testing things manually. And then just one call out on TypeScript, which is, I've heard from some people that they don't test because they use TypeScript. Deep down, everyone who uses TypeScript and who likes it knows that it doesn't guarantee a bug-free application, far from it. However, it can give for some people some a certain sense of false security, and as in, like, if TypeScript is not screaming at you, things should be fine. But just a reminder that TypeScript is a compile time type checker, not a runtime. So everything that happens at runtime is not going to be caught by TypeScript. And also, it's not going to handle actual implementation or specification errors. So it's just going to check the types and the data structures and everything, which is great. It's a great tool to use to give you a shorter feedback loop on those kinds of issues, but it does not mean that you're exempt from testing. Then some vocabulary and mentioning some of the tooling that we'll use for testing in the front end. The first thing you need something, a software that will allow you to write tests that kind of look like this. This is the Jasmine syntax, which is used by a framework called Jest. And the test runner, the primary reason you need it is just to allow you to write those tests. You have a test case, which is defined by that it function. You have one or more assertions. So if you're testing a function, you're checking if the return value is correct. That check is called an assertion. And the test runner is going to allow you to do that and then give you some kind of output. Maybe something in a terminal, maybe a process that fails so that you can use it in a CI environment, or other kinds of outputs. But then there's an example where we're using this spy on function. This is another kind of tool. So in this case, let's say I'm testing this user form components, where after submitting the form, I'm calling an external API. And this is the kind of thing that I don't really want to do in my tests. I'm not really interested in the way that the backend, the API is working. The only thing that I want to test in this case is just that, am I calling the API with the right parameters? And in this case, this spy on function is going to give me the two things that I need. I don't want to call this API over and over again in my automated tests. But at the same time, it gives me a way to watch the function calls, how many times it was called, was it called at all, with which parameters. And so with that kind of thing, I can make those kinds of assertions that I have here in the expect function. But then I also need a way to interact with the DOM. So especially some years ago, it was very common to test, for example, React components by checking their props or their states, or checking the current state of a Redux store or something. It's still valid to check something like a Redux reducer to have tests or unit tests for those. However, usually what you should be testing is the final result. It's what the browser is going to be rendering. It's what the user is going to experience indirectly, which is the DOM. So you need a way to have a DOM to render components into a DOM tree. That's going to be done by a library called JS DOM. And you also need, if you've ever done like a vanilla JS development, you know how hard it is to interact with DOM manually, all the little steps that you need for it. And there's another library called React Testing Library, or it actually was previously called React Testing Library. These days it's just Testing Library. It's just a family of libraries that allow you to do stuff like this user event calls to interact with inputs and buttons, other interactive elements, but also this render function here that allows you to render this component into a JS DOM tree. Yeah, and the end set of tools that we'll need is Jest, one as the testing framework that gives us both the running, the syntax, the assertions, but also all of the spying and mocking and stubbing that we need. JS DOM for the DOM, that's kind of integrated into Jest already, and testing library for all those interactions that we'll need. There's a few concepts that we'll not touch on right now, like snapshot testing and some other stuff, but we will touch on those subjects on the next couple of talks. All right, so for this week, since this is primarily an introduction, I did want to have already applications to show some examples, but the tests will be just JavaScript. So we'll not touch on component testing or anything for the DOM. We will do this next week. So just to show you the example, this is an extremely simple page. So I have this input at the top here, where I can input some kind of search. And then I have this API that will return me a list of appointments. And so the front end is also not just getting this result, but also grouping it by customer and showing one item for each. And this match is being done by the backend for either the customer name or a pet name here. And again, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of little hidden complexities here. Besides managing the API states, there's also little things like I have a date here that needs to be parsed and formatted. This date here, if this is a past date, if this is a future date, this tag shows up a month in the future. There's all these little things. And to show you the code, I'll send you guys the link to the repo later. But I did want to show you just real briefly the package.json file. And you will see here, testing library, a couple of things. One just the Jest DOM integration, one just for React. Another two libraries here, actually. Here, one for the DOM, one for those user events. There's Jest, there's the environment for JS DOM for Jest, JS DOM itself. So there's lots of little things for setup that will not go through just because there's a lot of little details. I do want to mention though that if you try to implement Jest in your projects, maybe in existing projects, or maybe something that you're just starting out, and you run into some issue that you cannot fix or run into a wall, don't hesitate to call me up. I can try to set up some time to work through the issues if needed, all right? But okay, so the example that I did want to go through today. So in this version, let's say this is a current version of the app, and maybe your product manager asked to add a little label here below the customer name, saying how many pets this customer has, right? Very simple logic, very simple stuff. So if the customer has no pets, or zero, or an empty pet list, just say no pets. If it's one pet, you say one pet. If there's multiple pets, you say the number, then pets, right? 3 pets, 4 pets, whatever. So fairly simple, and let's go through the development for this. So we'll start with just the customer component. So this component is the one that holds all of this. You can see here, there's the avatar image, here's the name. And so here below the name, I'm gonna add the little label there. I'm just gonna add a placeholder to show you where it's gonna be shown. So it's over here. All right, but to do this, I will isolate that logic into its own function. Call it pet list label. I will receive a list of pets, and then I will return some kind of string. I'm not going to implement it right now. Just to show that I'm calling the function and I'm rendering the result of the function. All right, so one quick word about TDD, or writing the tests first or later. That's something that I've heard different things from different people. I'll tell you my experience when it comes to when should you write the tests. Whenever I was writing simple functions like this, like very straightforward functions, or when I was writing tests for a backend, it was much more natural to write the test first compared to that thing when I'm doing integration tests in the front end. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of weeks. But when I'm making assertions on the DOM or making a snapshot test, it's kind of hard to predict the exact behavior that I'm going to need to test. And so in there, it feels more natural to write the test later. The point is, you should be writing the test either before or later. This time we'll do it before, just to make the point of how the framework works, but it's perfectly fine if you write it later. Anyway. All right, so I have my function here, and then I'm gonna write the tests first. This nomenclature here of having a tests folder, underline, and then the name with the test suffix. This is just something that I've been using, and gives me the little icons. It's easier to test, to search for in the fuzzy search. But whatever standard you have, just pick one and then use it for the entire projects. That's the whole point of naming things. It doesn't need to be something that everyone uses, just the project. But anyway, in this test file, then I'm gonna write this first function. This is from Jest. It's a describe function, a global function that Jest gives you. And this is just to group different test cases inside one test suite. So in this case, I'm gonna write 3 different tests for this one function. And I'm just gonna write this. So I give it a label and I pass a callback where I'm gonna write my actual tests. So I'm gonna write a test for each different case. So I can have 0, 1, or multiple pets. So I'm gonna write 3 different tests. So let's say it's returns label for an empty pet list. So in here, this it function, you can also write it as test. It's the exact same thing. I usually prefer it just because of the way that it reads in English. So it's kind of like I'm actually describing the function. It returns the correct label for an empty pet list, that's all. But you can use tests as well. So in here, I just have to do a couple of things. I have a setup and I have an assertion, right? So what I'm checking basically is, when I call my function, so expect pet list label, when called with a list of pets, and I expect the result to be no pets or no pets, right? And my setup is basically just creating an empty, just need to import this type. I am using TypeScript. It must be obvious at this point for everyone, but naturally, all of this is possible with JavaScript. All right, so I have this test, and then if I run it, and running just means just call the Jest CLI that you have available once you install the Jest library. You will see it fail, and it will give you some information. So it expected the value no pets over here, but I gave it dummy because I didn't implement the function yet. This information with the stack trace and everything should be enough most of the time. However, I've had the experience of Jest giving me very non-descriptive messages that were kind of hard to debug. But again, this is another thing that if you run into a wall when testing or whatever, ask on the JavaScript channel or call me up for a quick call. We'll try to go through it. All right, coming back here. So we have one test and this test is failing. I'm just gonna write the other two tests already. And I do have some data ready here just so that I don't type over and over again. So I have a second case where it returns the correct label for a single pet list, right? And in this case, I expect it to be one pet. And then, actually, this has two. So for a multiple pet list. All right. So now I have three tests and all of those should fail. All right. At this point, then I can actually implement function. So again, extremely simple. It could be just one liner with a couple of ternary operations, but I'll write it in the more like obvious kind of way. So pet length equals 0. I'll return no pets. It's one pet, and then the generic case. Right. And then if I run this, I should get all of my tests passing. So another quick word here about coverage. So if I run Jest with a -- coverage argument, I will get this kind of output where I get this little matrix of results. So it will tell me some information about how much of my code is being tested. So for example, let's say I remove this one test here that tests the one bad case. It will give me like the results that not all of my code is being tested. So there's statements, branches, functions, and lines, different kinds of metrics. Personally, usually this one is the more useful for me, branches. And in this case, it means my code has 3 different branches that my code can take. If it falls inside this, if inside this one or this one, return. And it didn't go through this one. So it's complaining that line 9 here is uncovered. So again, we'll talk about coverage in the next week. But just one thing that I did want to call out immediately is that usually 100% coverage is something that is very unpractical, especially for a large code base. But even non-100% code coverage gives you much more confidence than not having any tests, naturally. All right, so there is another case here that I will not go through for live coding, but this repository here has another wrench called part1 tested. This has this test here written in a slightly different way using the its.each construct. If you want to take a look at it, you can check out the branch. This construct specifically is very useful for tests that are very repetitive. So you're writing the same setup over and over again. You can just use parameters instead and write one single test that turns into multiple tests depending on how many parameters you have. But it also has tests for this class. So as I mentioned, like in this, and I closed up the server there. But anyway, for that UI there, you have a couple of dates being manipulated, parsed, and formatted. And currently, this class has no tests. In this branch, it does. However, it has a bug here. This function, add, to manipulate the dates, is very buggy. And so if you guys want, naturally, it's not mandatory. But if you want to go through it and maybe write a code that makes the test pass, it might be an interesting experience to deal with Jest, the output that it gives you when a test is failing and everything. But all right, so I will post the link to this repository to the JavaScript channel maybe, or maybe the general channel, doesn't matter. And then next week, we'll talk a little bit about coverage. but also about tiers of testing, integration units, functional testing. And we'll go through some actual React examples, test a component, maybe a custom hook, to see like more advanced examples and not just testing a simple JavaScript function. But that's it. And until next week, we have 3 minutes. So if anyone has questions that we can answer in 3 minutes before my next call, feel free to do so. Any other questions that you might have, that you guys might have, you can just ask them in the JavaScript channel, just so that we don't spam the general channel, and we can keep the conversation going there as well.